What keyboard should I buy? That is such a common question that I get as a teacher. So today in this video, we're going to go through some real detailed specifics about what kind of keyboard might suit you. And as you're aware, there are so many different kinds of keyboards. Some of them are fantastic and some of them are pure junk. So the goal of this video is to find a good keyboard that fits you as a musician. Before we dig into the options available on electronic keyboards, let's talk about terms that you might hear. You might go into a piano store and you'll hear the salesman talking about something called a digital piano. This actually is a keyboard. But the digital piano market is typically made up of keyboards that are designed to be used at home and not moved around. And a lot of their emphasis on digital pianos is appearance. And they'll put a lot of emphasis on making the keyboard look like a piece of furniture. They'll include things like wood grain, or they'll even go so far as to try and make the digital piano look like an acoustic piano, and even give them like a grand piano lid or a grand piano case. It's amazing. Now you might get the impression that I'm biased against digital pianos. I'm not at all. They look fantastic. It's just good to know that a large portion of your purchase price is going toward appearance. Now here's how this plays out. If you buy the lower end models, well, they're still going to make them look good because they're going to be in your living room. So they're going to focus most of the quality and most of the expense on the case. So what can you do? Well, pull out your wallet, because whether you buy the low or the high-end version, you're going to pay for good looks. If you want good looks along with a great instrument, buy the higher-end model. In the long run, you'll be so glad that you did that. Another term you might hear when you're out looking for a keyboard is the term synthesizer. This is really an older term dating back to the 60s when keyboards actually did synthesize the sound. This means that they actually created the sound as it was being played. So the computer would create the sound using all kind of electronic components like modulators and oscillators and a bunch of nerdy things, but they were really quite cool. An interesting note is that synthesizers, true synthesizers, are kind of making a comeback, just like everything vintage kind of makes its way around again. Most modern keyboards are not synthesizers. Most modern keyboards have all the sounds pre-recorded. And so when you press a key, it simply plays back the pre-recorded sound. Finally, as you're out shopping, you'll hear just the general term keyboard. And this refers to what you see most of the time. Keyboards that are designed to take with you and move relatively portably. And these keyboards have a whole range of options, and really this is where we're going to spend the most of our time on the video today, talking about the options of the modern keyboard. The very first option that you should have on your list as you're looking for a modern keyboard is the feature touch sensitivity. This is very simple to understand, but it's not included in all keyboards. This simply means that when you press a key softly, the sound is soft, like this. And of course, when you press harder, the sound comes out louder. Now, the keyboard I'm playing has the option to turn touch sensitivity on and off. Let me turn it off and play a passage for you, and you can see how sterile and lifeless it sounds. All the notes will be exactly the same volume. Now I'll turn touch sensitivity back on in my keyboard. I'll play the same passage again and listen to the differences in volume or dynamics between the notes. And these differences are very natural. They're one of the most powerful things that makes music come alive. To get this feature, you've got to spend at least somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 for a keyboard, which, to be honest, is very, very cheap for a keyboard. But the cheapest of all the keyboards, like, $60, $70 at Costco or Best Buy, they probably won't have touch sensitivity. And here's the danger. If you start playing on a keyboard that does not have touch sensitivity, you'll develop a lifeless typewriter-like technique. and your music won't have any changes or dynamics. And you'll never have music that, frankly, people will want to listen to. So make this at the top of your list as you're shopping for a keyboard that has touch sensitivity. Option number 2, as you're shopping for a keyboard, you'll see that many keyboards have different numbers of keys. Now, the maximum number of keys, the biggest keyboards, have 88 keys, and this really is desirable. It matches the acoustic piano that you'll find in a concert hall. So if you can afford it, get a keyboard that has 88 keys. Some of the smaller keyboards have 76 keys or 61 keys or even 49 or 44 keys. And the manufacturers just keep chopping keys off from the top and the bottom to make the keyboards a little cheaper. Now, having said all that, sometimes you want a smaller keyboard just for portability. Or if you're a keyboard superstar and you want a keyboard you can strap around your neck and run around the stage, that's when you're going to want to have a keyboard with maybe 44 notes or something like that. But for the vast majority of us, you're going to want to have a keyboard that has 88 keys. And here's a real important point. Make sure the keys themselves, each one of the keys, are full size. On keyboards that are, for lack of a better term, toys, sometimes manufacturers will make the individual keys smaller. And that really will give you lots of problems in the long run because as musicians, we rely on something called muscle memory. So that as you learn the distances between the notes, your hands will remember those distances. And as you graduate from the toy keyboard with tiny little keys to a bigger keyboard, you're going to be playing lots of wrong notes. And it's very difficult. I've seen people have a very difficult time getting over this hurdle. So buy a keyboard that has 88 full-size keys. Option number 3, and I really struggled whether I should put this as option number 2 or 1 because these top options are just so important. But this option is called weighted keys. So if you find a keyboard that has weighted keys, you'll have found a keyboard that's going to be the best keyboard for the long-term health of your hands. And what I mean is this: a keyboard with weighted keys actually has parts inside the keyboard that you can't see that have mass or weight to them. Then when your finger comes down and starts to press the key, all of that energy is transferred into those moving parts inside the keyboard, and those weighted parts begin to move. Now, in a cheap keyboard where there's no weighted keys and the key is simply held up with a cheap little spring, your finger comes crashing down. And as soon as that spring gets compressed and that key hits the dead stop on the bottom of the keyboard, suddenly you've got a shock wave that goes back up your arm. And guess what? After a couple months of playing a keyboard like that, you've got tendinitis. I know, because it happened to me. Back in college, I had a keyboard that didn't have weighted keys because college students don't have any money. So I had a keyboard that just had, little springs. And I played that thing. I lived on it night and day. And eventually, I started getting tendinitis in both my arms. And the doc said, listen, if you don't stop doing what you're doing, you're not going to be able to play. So as soon as I found that out about that keyboard, I deep-sixed it. I got rid of it and spent the money. I actually went in debt, which I wouldn't advise, but I went in debt and got a great keyboard with weighted keys, and I haven't had a problem since. So if you want to play for years and years and minimize your risk of getting tendinitis, spend the money and get a keyboard that has weighted keys. Option number 4. This has to do with polyphony. Poly meaning many, and phone means sounds. So when you want to know about the polyphony of a keyboard, you want to know how many sounds it can produce at the same time. For instance, cheap keyboards will have something like 8-note polyphony, meaning they can play up to 8 notes at the same time. And you might be thinking, well, I've only got 10 fingers. Am I really going to be playing more than 8 notes at the same time? You'd be surprised, especially when you start talking about using the sustain pedal. Now, as you may or may not know, the sustain pedal will continue holding on to notes that your fingers have played as long as your foot stays pressed down on that sustain pedal. And let's say you've played a 5-note chord, which is pretty common, and then you play a couple melody notes on top, and you add another bass line. Suddenly you've used all 8 notes. And what begins to happen if you exceed the polyphony of the keyboard is notes begin dropping out. And you'd think, well, that's okay. It really sounds awful. You'll have a note underneath a chord that's playing along, and then it gets cut off. Bump. And it sounds like it leaves a hole in your music. You really begin to notice if the polyphony of your keyboard is too low. And what happens if you want to layer sounds? You want to have piano and strings playing at the same time, and you play a 5-note chord. Well, guess what? When you're playing a layered sound, you've got 5 piano notes and 5 string notes, but your keyboard only has 8-note polyphony. Well, some notes are going to get cut off, and it's going to sound terrible again. So make sure you spend enough money to get at least 64, 98, or 128 notes of polyphony. It sounds like a lot, but it's actually becoming pretty standard. That way, you'll never run out of sounds as you layer sounds or use your sustain pedal. Option number 5, MIDI. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Data Interface, and it's simply a way to communicate between keyboards and computers. For instance, using MIDI, you can connect 2 keyboards together, and you can play the keys of one keyboard, but you can have the sounds coming out of another keyboard. That may sound crazy to you, but it's actually very useful. We'll talk about that a little later. Another application for MIDI may be if you want to record what you play into a computer. You can simply connect your keyboard and computer via MIDI, and then the computer records the notes on and off, and exactly when you played them and how hard you played them, and then you can play it back from the computer and fix anything you need to fix, and you can change the sounds on your keyboard so you can get it just right. So MIDI is a very extremely useful technology. Now, the MIDI capability used to be an option on most keyboards, but now MIDI capability is standard on most keyboards. The option now is how MIDI connects to your keyboard. The connections used to only be available through MIDI cables and MIDI ports on your keyboard, in, out, and through. But now, USB is becoming standard, so that you'll find keyboards that have just a USB port, and it's very easily connected to your computer with a USB cable, just like a printer. The great thing about the newer USB connections is that they're screaming fast, so that as you play notes, they are almost instantaneously recorded in the computer or played on another keyboard. If you need to connect a USB keyboard to an older keyboard that only has MIDI inputs, you can use a converter that's sold at music stores. Option number 6, memory. This is really a super important option, and I'll tell you why. Keyboard manufacturers try to sell keyboards. That's obvious. And the way they typically will do it, especially lesser quality, lesser expensive keyboards, is to overwhelm you with thousands of sounds and dozens of buttons and knobs on the keyboard. And what they're hoping is that you'll look at the keyboard and you'll say, hey, look at this. This keyboard has 1,000 sounds. It must be the one to buy. But what they're not telling you is that they've got 1,000 sounds, but very small memory in the brain of the keyboard, so they've got to divvy that memory up into 1,000 different sections, one for each of the sounds that's pre-recorded. So what happens? You're in the store, you pick one of the sounds, and you press and hold down a key. The problem now is the keyboard does not have enough memory allocated to that sound to keep that sound going. So what do? The manufacturers get around this by only recording the very beginning of each sound, and then for the remaining time that you're holding down the key, they continue looping the middle section of the sound over and over, which in the store doesn't seem like a problem because you're overwhelmed by, well, gee, look at all the sounds, and then they got this goofy little drum patch, and you're overwhelmed by that. But when you get home and you're playing those sounds, your ear guaranteed will start picking up that repetitive nature of the sound, and you may not be aware of it, but your ears will get fatigued of that sound, and you'll think, why do I hate the sound of this keyboard? And eventually it's pushed back underneath the bed. So what do? You go into the store and you ignore all the bells and the whistles and the knobs and the lights and the thousands of sounds. Ask the salesperson for some headphones. Plug them in, and then pick a sound on the keyboard, and then play a 4 or 5-note chord. And instead of playing other notes, just continue holding those notes down. And then as the sound continues, ask yourself this question: do I hear the sound looping, or does it continue on naturally and sound like a natural sound? If you start hearing the loops, then you know that keyboard is going to bug you really bad within a couple weeks of getting it home. So it's really important to find out how that memory is allocated in the keyboard, and that's a great way to find out. Option number 7, type of keyboard. We're going to look at 3 different types of keyboards. The most common type of keyboard is just called a keyboard, and it has sounds and it has speakers, and you can pick from the different sounds and play to your heart's content. That's a standard keyboard. A step up from there is something called a workstation. A workstation also has sounds, it also has keys, maybe it has speakers, but it has the addition of something called a sequencer, where it can actually record everything you're doing, similar to being in a studio, meaning you can record a piano part and then you can rewind that, and as you're listening to your piano part, you can lay down a bass part and rewind that, and as you're listening to that, you can lay down another instrument. That's called a workstation, where you can kind of emulate what a studio does. The opposite to a workstation is something called a controller. Now, a controller is a keyboard that only has keys. It doesn't have any sounds on board. It doesn't have any sequencer to record anything. It simply has keys, and then it has a MIDI connection so that you can connect to another keyboard and play the sounds of another keyboard, or connect to a computer and play and record sounds out of a computer. Now, that might sound really limiting to you. It doesn't have any sounds, doesn't have any speakers. Why would I buy that? Here's the giant plus for buying just a controller. When you buy a controller, 100% of your money is going into the quality built into the moving parts of the keyboard. Now, realistically, I know most people won't go out and buy just a controller for their first keyboard. I probably wouldn't have either. They'll buy a keyboard that also has sounds on board that they like. So with that in mind, here's my recommendation. When you go out and buy a keyboard, get one that has sounds that you really like. But just kind of keep in mind that someday you're going to want to upgrade those sounds. And when you do, you're going to want to use this keyboard then as a controller. So it's got to have great hardware or a great action, which includes touch sensitivity. It has 88 weighted full-size keys and includes a USB MIDI connection. That way, down the road, when you're ready to update your sounds, you can use the first keyboard as a controller, and then you can play new sounds through another cheaper keyboard, or you can play them through your laptop. And guess what? The moving parts or the action of any keyboard are the only parts of that keyboard that don't get outdated or don't go out of style. For instance, let's say you buy a keyboard that has good sounds and it's got a good action, so you spend a lot of money. But in a couple years, what happens? The technology improves and the sounds are much better in a couple years. So to upgrade, you've got to buy a whole new keyboard with a good action and good sounds again. And you keep spending this money year after year. Here's a much better plan. Keep your good keyboard that has a great action and that you've spent your money on, and then use your MIDI capability to connect to and play a newer keyboard that may have better sounds, but maybe not a high quality action like the keyboard that you've already got. Another option is to take this fantastic keyboard with a great action that you already own and connect it with your USB cable to your computer, because computers, obviously, they have way more horsepower than any keyboard ever thought of having. So what folks are doing is they're taking their keyboard and they're connecting it to their computer with a USB cable. It's awesome. In fact, you'll see a lot of performers now. Look at the keyboard player. Many times they'll have their keyboard and they'll have a cable going off to a laptop, and the sound is actually coming out of the laptop because that can be updated almost for free. You know, your keyboard has to be bought with a pretty good chunk of change, especially if you're going to get a good action and weighted keys and the whole 9 yards. But then once you've got that, you can upgrade your sounds by playing through a laptop or another keyboard. So I hope this has been helpful for you. 7 options to think about as you're going out to get yourself a keyboard that'll fit you as a musician. My name is David Sprunger from playpianotoday.com. Thanks for listening. Now you know what to do. Go practice.